Your parents told you renting is throwing money away. Your uncle repeated it at every family gathering until it became background noise. Your coworker, who just bought a house, said it with the specific confidence of someone who signed paperwork 3 weeks ago and is now an expert. And somewhere along the way, you absorbed it as a fact rather than an opinion. Renting is throwing money away. Buying is building wealth. That is the rule. Except here is what nobody told your parents, your uncle, or your coworker. That rule was written for a housing market that no longer exists. It was written when interest rates were 4%, when home prices were 3 times median income instead of nearly 6, when the median monthly mortgage payment was cheaper than the median monthly rent instead of 20% more expensive than it. The world those rules describe is gone, and the people still following those rules in 2026 are making financial decisions based on a map of a country that has been completely redrawn. This video is not an argument that you should never buy a home. It is an argument that the reflexive assumption that buying is always smarter than renting is costing specific people real money in the specific market that exists right now. And figuring out whether you are one of those people is what the next 12 minutes are going to do. My name is Sig, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, housing economics, and the specific financial rules that worked in one era and quietly became traps in another without anyone officially announcing the change. If you are renting right now and feeling the social pressure of being told you should be buying, or if you are seriously considering buying and want an honest framework for whether that actually makes sense in your specific situation in 2026, subscribe to this channel right now and give this video a thumbs up if it gives you permission to make the decision that actually fits your life rather than the one that makes you sound responsible at a dinner party. Let me start with the actual numbers, because this conversation cannot be had honestly without them. As of early 2026, the national median monthly mortgage payment is 20% higher than the median rent, a dramatic reversal from the 2010s, when buying was often cheaper. Read that again. The average monthly cost of owning a home is now 20% more expensive than the average monthly cost of renting a comparable home. This is not a small difference. In a situation where renting costs $2,000 a month, buying the equivalent home costs approximately $2,400. That $400 monthly difference is $4,800 per year that a renter keeps in their pocket that an owner does not. Over 5 years, that is $24,000. Over 10 years, it is $48,000. That money, if invested rather than spent on the premium cost of ownership, does not disappear. It compounds. In many markets across the United States, the average buyer may not financially outperform renting for roughly 6 years after purchasing a home. In several expensive metropolitan areas, including Seattle, Los Angeles, and Austin, it could take between 17 and 23 years before buying becomes financially advantageous compared with renting. 17 to 23 years, not 17 to 23 months, years. These numbers do not mean buying is always wrong. They mean the automatic assumption that buying is always right is financially dangerous in the market that currently exists. Let me dismantle the throwing money away argument properly, because it is the foundation of the bias against renting, and it deserves a direct and honest response rather than dismissal. The argument goes like this: when you rent, every dollar you pay disappears. You own nothing at the end of the month. When you pay a mortgage, part of your payment builds equity. You are building something. This argument sounds airtight until you look at where a mortgage payment actually goes in the early years of a loan. On a $400,000 mortgage at 6.5%, your first monthly payment of approximately $2,528 breaks down like this. Approximately $2,167 goes to interest. Approximately $361 goes to principal. You paid $2,528 and built $361 of equity. The remaining $2,167, 85% of your payment, went to the bank, not to your equity, not to your future, to interest. When someone tells you renting is throwing money away because your payment builds no equity, they are ignoring the fact that the overwhelming majority of early mortgage payments also build no equity. They just flow to a lender instead of a landlord. And unlike rent, a mortgage payment comes with property taxes, homeowner's insurance, PMI if you put down less than 20%, and maintenance costs, money that a renter never pays. The comparison is not renting versus building equity. It is which version of housing costs leaves you in a better overall financial position, including what you do with the money you did not spend on the premium cost of ownership. Let me show you what the math actually looks like for two real people making this decision in the same city in 2026. Elena and David both earn $90,000 a year in the same mid-sized American city. Both have $45,000 saved. Elena decides to buy a 4-100-and-20,000 home with her $45,000 as a down payment, just over 10%. Her real monthly housing cost, including mortgage, property taxes, insurance, PMI, and a maintenance reserve, comes to approximately $4,100 per month. Her take-home pay after taxes and retirement contributions is approximately $5,200 per month. Housing consumes approximately 79% of her take-home pay. She has roughly $1,100 per month for everything else in her life. She is not investing anything beyond her retirement contributions because there is nothing left. David decides to rent a comparable home in the same neighborhood for $2,400 per month. His take-home is the same $5,200. Housing consumes approximately 46% of his take-home pay. He has approximately $2,800 per month remaining after rent. David takes the difference between what Elena is paying for housing and what he is paying, $1,700 per month, and invests it consistently in a broad market index fund at 8% annual return. After 5 years, David has accumulated approximately $124,000 in invested assets through those monthly contributions alone, on top of his original $45,000, which has also been growing. After 5 years, Elena has built approximately $30,000 to $40,000 in equity through mortgage principal reduction on a home that may or may not have appreciated meaningfully in a market where 5 to 7 years is the minimum holding period before buying reliably beats renting. The math is not as clear as the throwing money away argument implies. For the specific 5-year window, in the specific market where they live, David the renter is building more accessible, more liquid, more flexible wealth than Elena the homeowner. Here is the specific calculation that the most sophisticated housing economists used to evaluate whether buying or renting makes financial sense in a particular market, and that almost nobody in the popular personal finance conversation ever mentions directly. The price-to-rent ratio. It is calculated by dividing the median home price in a market by the annual rent for a comparable property. A price-to-rent ratio below 15 generally indicates that buying is financially advantageous compared to renting in that market. A ratio above 20 generally indicates that renting is the financially superior choice. Between 15 and 20 is a gray zone where personal circumstances, timeline, and life factors matter more than the math alone. Nationally, the ratio is about 15.7, putting the country overall in toss-up territory. Midwest and southern states like Mississippi, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, and Kansas have price-to-rent ratios well below 15. In these markets, buying generally makes clear financial sense if you plan to stay for a reasonable period. But in coastal metros, the picture is radically different. In San Francisco, the price-to-rent ratio is above 30. In Los Angeles, it exceeds 25. In Seattle and Austin, it sits well above 20. In these markets, the math explicitly favors renting for the majority of households who are not planning to stay in the same home for an extended period, which is an honest description of most working Americans in their 30s and early 40s. Calculate the price-to-rent ratio for your specific market before making any housing decision. It takes about 2 minutes, and it tells you more about whether buying makes financial sense in your location than any amount of general advice about the universal superiority of home ownership. Here is the argument against renting that deserves the most honest response, because it is partially true. Renters who simply spend the money they save compared to owning do not build wealth from renting. The financial advantage of renting only materializes when the difference between renting and owning costs is consistently invested rather than spent. This is real, and it matters. The renter who pays $2,400 per month instead of $4,000 per month for comparable housing and spends the -$100 difference on lifestyle upgrades rather than investments ends up with neither equity nor a portfolio. They have simply consumed the financial advantage of renting rather than converting it into wealth. Renting frees up capital for other investments, while homeownership forces automatic savings through mortgage principal reduction. The honest comparison between renting and buying is not renting versus owning. It is disciplined renting, with consistent investment of the difference versus owning and building equity through mortgage payments. For people who are genuinely disciplined about investing the difference, renting in the current market can build meaningful wealth faster than owning in many markets over a 5 to 10-year window. For people who would simply spend the difference, the forced savings mechanism of a mortgage has real value even at higher total costs. Knowing yourself honestly on this dimension is part of the calculation. Let me be specific about the situations where the math, the data, and the life circumstances most clearly point toward renting as the financially smarter decision, rather than leaving this as an abstract discussion. The first situation is when you live in a high price-to-rent ratio market and your timeline is uncertain. If you live in or near a major coastal metro, if your price-to-rent ratio above 20, and if you cannot commit to staying in the same home for at least 7 to 10 years, the math of buying does not reliably work in your favor. Transaction costs of buying and selling typically run 5 to 10% of the home's value. You need enough time and appreciation to recover those costs before the ownership equation turns positive. In markets where appreciation has slowed and where the price-to-rent ratio is high, 7 to 10 years is a realistic minimum, and many buyers in their early to mid-30s do not have clarity about their location plans over that horizon. The second situation is when buying requires you to stretch your monthly budget beyond 30% of take-home pay. A housing cost that exceeds 30% of actual take-home pay creates financial fragility, regardless of whether it is rent or a mortgage. But a mortgage that exceeds this threshold comes with much higher exit costs than a lease that exceeds it. If buying in your current market requires you to direct more than 30% of your take-home pay toward total housing costs, renting while building savings and waiting for either your income to grow or market conditions to shift is not surrendering. It is financial strategy. The third situation is when buying would require depleting your emergency fund and investment contributions simultaneously. The down payment, closing costs, and immediate maintenance reserve requirements of home ownership in 2026 can easily require $80,000 to $100,000 or more in liquid capital at the moment of purchase. If reaching that threshold means arriving at closing with no emergency fund and no ability to continue retirement contributions for an extended period after purchase, the long-term financial cost of that gap often exceeds the wealth-building advantage of early homeownership. There are 3 financial advantages of renting that the homeownership advocates almost never acknowledge because they do not fit the narrative. The first is flexibility. With 40% of Americans planning on moving in 2026, many are reassessing whether homeownership or renting better fits their financial goals. Mobility has real economic value. The ability to relocate for a better job opportunity, to follow a career trajectory into a higher-earning city, or simply to adjust your living situation as your life changes is worth real money that does not show up in any mortgage versus rent comparison. The transaction costs of selling a home, typically 5 to 10% of the sale price, can easily run $20,000 to $40,000 on a $400,000 property. A renter can be out of their lease with 60 days' notice for a few $1,000s at most. That flexibility premium is part of the true cost comparison that most ownership advocates ignore. The second is maintenance freedom. Homeowners spend an average of 1 to 2% of their home's value annually on maintenance and repairs. on a $400,000 home, that is $4,000 to $8,000 per year, or $300 to $660 per month, that renters simply do not pay. It is also a source of financial and logistical stress that does not show up in any monthly payment comparison, but is very real in the lived experience of homeownership. The third is the absence of concentration risk. A homeowner who has a significant portion of their net worth tied up in a single property in a single market is financially concentrated in a way that a renter who invests the ownership premium across a diversified index fund portfolio is not. Housing markets can and do underperform expectations over extended periods in specific geographic areas, and a homeowner whose primary asset underperforms does not have the same flexibility to rebalance that an investor with a diversified portfolio does. Let me be completely direct about the situations where buying is clearly the right financial decision. So this video is not misread as an argument that nobody should ever buy a home. Buying makes clear financial sense when your price-to-rent ratio in your specific market is below 15, meaning the math structurally favors ownership. When your total housing cost after buying will sit at or below 30% of your actual take-home pay with a genuine emergency fund remaining intact after closing, when you have a realistic and high-confidence expectation of staying in the same location for a minimum of 5 years and ideally 7 to 10, when your down payment and closing costs can be covered without depleting your investment accounts or emergency fund to zero, and when the lifestyle and stability benefits of ownership, which are real and genuinely valuable and not reducible to pure financial math, are important enough to your life that they belong in the calculation alongside the numbers. These conditions are all currently satisfiable in the right markets at the right price points by the right buyers. The problem is not that buying is wrong in 2026. The problem is that the reflexive cultural assumption that buying is always right, regardless of market conditions, personal timeline, or financial readiness, is causing specific people to make expensive decisions that do not actually serve them. There is no universal answer to the rent versus buy question in 2026. Anyone who gives you one is either selling something or has not looked at the data carefully enough to understand how dramatically it varies by market, by personal timeline, by financial position, and by life circumstances. What exists instead of a universal answer is a framework. Your price-to-rent ratio tells you what the math says about your specific market. Your real monthly cost calculation tells you whether buying fits your actual take-home pay without financial strain. Your timeline tells you whether you will stay long enough for the transaction costs to become worth it. And your honest self-assessment tells you whether you are the kind of person who would invest the difference if you rented, or whether the forced savings mechanism of a mortgage serves your financial behavior better than the optionality of renting. Run those for calculations honestly for your specific situation, and then ignore what your parents said, what your uncle implied, and what your coworker who signed papers 3 weeks ago believes with absolute certainty. The smartest move in housing is never the one that sounds the most responsible at a dinner table. It is the one that the actual math of your actual life, in your actual market, at this actual moment in time supports. That move might be buying, it might be renting, but it is almost certainly not whatever the throwing money away argument assumes before doing any of the math.